The day I came home early from work and found 8 people in my backyard swimming in my pool, drinking my beer, and playing music through a Bluetooth speaker someone had hooked up to my outdoor outlet. I did not say a single word. I walked back inside, sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started building the case that would cost them everything they thought they had gotten away with. My name is Renee Calloway. I am 47 years old, a licensed civil engineer with 19 years of experience in infrastructure planning, and I have lived in the Harborview Terrace HOA community in coastal South Carolina for 7 years. I bought my house after my mother passed and left me a modest inheritance that I had been careful with, the way she had always been careful with money, the way people are careful with things that cost something real to obtain. The house was a 3-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot with a covered back porch, a mature magnolia in the front yard, and a heated in-ground pool that the previous owners had installed and maintained beautifully. The pool had a travertine deck, a raised spa with a spillover waterfall feature, and a screen enclosure that kept the bugs out and the privacy in. It was the nicest thing I had ever owned, and I knew it, and I did not take it for granted for a single day. For the first 4 years in Harborview Terrace, everything was as it should be. The neighborhood was quiet in the measured way of coastal communities, where the heat slows everything down to a pace that feels reasonable. My neighbors to the left were a retired couple named George and Sylvia Tanner who kept a meticulous garden and left fresh vegetables on my porch twice a summer without explanation, which I found deeply touching. My neighbors to the right were a young professional couple named the Delacroix who worked long hours and were rarely home, and whose primary contribution to the neighborhood was keeping their grass cut and their driveway clean, which was genuinely all I asked of anyone. The house directly across the back fence sold 3 years ago to a family named the Wades. Father named Clifton, mother named Brenda, 2 adult children who apparently visited frequently and brought their own social circles with them. Clifton Wade was 58, recently semi-retired from what he described at every neighborhood gathering as a very successful commercial real estate career. He said this not once as context, but repeatedly as identity, the way certain men carry their professional history like a credential they need you to see at all times. Brenda was warm in the automatic way of someone who had spent decades managing social situations for a husband who generated them. The adult children, a son named Garrett and a daughter named Paisley, were in their mid to late 20s and had the particular quality of people who had grown up getting most of what they wanted and had not yet encountered a situation that corrected that expectation. The first summer the Wades were behind me passed without incident. The second summer I started noticing that the back gate of my screen enclosure, which latched from the inside, was occasionally unlatched when I came home from work. I assumed I had forgotten to secure it. I am thorough by profession and habit, so this seemed unlikely, but I accepted it because the alternative explanation required a degree of deliberate intrusion I was not ready to assign to people I barely knew. The truth arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in June when I left work 3 hours early because of a migraine that turned out not to be a migraine at all. I pulled into my driveway, walked around to the backyard gate, and heard music before I reached the fence. Not faint music, confident music, the kind playing through a system that someone has decided is performing at an appropriate volume for a good afternoon. I unlatched the backyard gate and walked to the screen enclosure door and looked through the screen at my pool. 8 people, 4 in the water, 4 on the deck furniture that I had bought 2 summers ago at a cost I still remembered exactly, because it had taken me 3 months to justify the expense. Someone had moved the outdoor side table and placed a cooler where it had been. Someone had connected a Bluetooth speaker to the exterior outlet on the back wall of my house. Someone had helped themselves to 4 bottles of beer from the outdoor refrigerator built into my covered porch, and those bottles were sitting on the travertine deck leaving rings on the surface. I stood at the screen door for a full 30 seconds. I recognized Garrett Wade immediately. He was in the pool with a woman I did not know, Paisley was on the deck on one of my lounge chairs with a man I did not know. The other 4 people were strangers to me entirely. None of them had noticed me. I turned around and walked back into my house through the back porch door, which I noticed had also been opened without my permission, and I sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. The migraine, which had not actually been a migraine, was entirely gone. I am a civil engineer. My professional life is built on documentation, specifications, and the understanding that problems which are not properly documented cannot be properly solved. I opened a new document and typed the date, the time, a description of what I had observed, and a list of every item I could identify that had been accessed without my permission. Then I went back outside with my phone and photographed everything through the screen before any of them saw me. I got clean photographs of all 8 people. I got photographs of the cooler, the speaker connected to my outlet, the beer bottles on the travertine, the moved furniture. I got a clear photograph of the outdoor refrigerator door standing open. Then I opened the screen door and walked onto the pool deck. Garrett Wade saw me first. He was in the water, and his expression moved through several stages very quickly, starting at surprise and landing somewhere between calculation and the beginning of a prepared response. He said, "Renee, hey, we were just..." I said, "Get out of my pool, all of you right now." The music kept playing for about 4 seconds because whoever controlled the phone had not reacted yet. Then it stopped. The 8 people looked at each other and then at me, and then began the process of getting out of the water and gathering their things. Nobody said anything particularly. There was a quality in the air of people who have been caught doing something they knew was wrong, and are hoping that if they move quietly enough the situation will resolve without escalating. Garrett began to say something about how they had just stopped by and hoped I would not mind, and it was such a hot day, and the gate had been. I said, "Do not explain this to me, go home." They left through the back gate, all 8 of them. I stood on my pool deck and watched them go, and then I went back inside and added to my documentation and called my attorney. I had a property attorney named Delia Marsh, who I had used for the closing on my house, and retained for a small ongoing fee, because I had learned in 19 years of infrastructure work that having legal counsel available before you need it urgently is worth considerably more than the retainer cost. Delia answered and I described what had happened. She said, "First incident you are aware of." I said, "First confirmed incident. There have been signs for several weeks that the gate has been accessed." She said, "Install cameras today. Document everything going forward. Send the Wades a formal written notice by certified mail this week. I will draft it. Do not confront them verbally again before they receive the letter." I installed cameras that evening. A system of 4, covering the pool deck from 2 angles, the back gate, and the screen enclosure door. The system logged continuously to a cloud account and sent motion alerts to my phone. I mounted them myself in 2 hours because I understand structural attachments and I had the right drill bits. Delia's letter went out by certified mail 3 days later. It was precise and unambiguous. It documented the June incident, described the unauthorized access to my private property, the use of my outdoor electrical outlet, the use of my outdoor refrigerator, and the presence of 8 individuals, none of whom had my permission to be on my property. It stated that the screen enclosure surrounding my pool was private property, not a community amenity, and that unauthorized entry constituted trespass under South Carolina law. It requested written acknowledgement that the Wades understood this and formal assurance that it would not happen again. It noted that I had photographic documentation of the incident, and that future incidents would be handled through law enforcement and civil litigation. Clifton Wade received the letter on a Thursday. He called me that same evening. He used the voice of a man who had spent his career managing uncomfortable conversations from a position of assumed authority. He said the letter was unnecessary and heavy-handed, and that they had simply enjoyed a neighbor's pool on a hot day the way people do in communities like ours, and that surely a civil engineer understood something about the practical realities of community living. I said, Clifton, I need you to read the letter again, specifically the paragraph about South Carolina trespass law, and then I need you to respond in writing to my attorney. He said, lawyers and letters over a pool is not the kind of neighbor I hoped you would be. I said, I hope you will respond to the letter within the requested time frame. Good night. He did not respond to the letter within the requested time frame. He did not respond to it at all. Brenda called me 4 days later and said she was sorry about the whole thing and that Clifton had found the letter upsetting and she wanted to smooth things over. I told Brenda I appreciated the call and that the situation was straightforward, and I simply needed written assurance from her household that the trespassing would stop. She said she would speak to Clifton. No written assurance arrived. 2 weeks later, my phone sent a motion alert at 11 in the morning on a Saturday. I was at the grocery store. I opened the alert and watched live footage of Garrett Wade climbing over my back fence, bypassing the gate entirely, dropping onto my pool deck, and opening the screen enclosure door from the outside by reaching through the gap at the bottom corner of the frame where the screen met the deck, a technique that required knowing exactly where to reach. He had been here enough times to know that. I called Delia from the grocery store parking lot. I watched on my phone while we talked as Garrett settled onto one of my lounge chairs with his phone. He appeared to be alone this time. He was not in the pool. He was simply using my deck as though it were available to him. Delia said, I am filing for a temporary restraining order Monday morning. I am also sending a second letter today by email since we have their email from the original correspondence, notifying them that a second incident has occurred and is documented, and that legal proceedings are being initiated. I said, do it. I did not go home immediately. I finished my grocery shopping because there was nothing I needed to confront in person, and because Delia had advised me not to engage directly while proceedings were being initiated. The camera was running. The footage was saving. Everything I needed was being collected without me standing in my backyard. When I got home 40 minutes later, Garrett was gone. The lounge chair was slightly moved, and there was a water bottle on the travertine deck that had not been there before. I photographed it, added it to the documentation file, and sent everything to Delia. The second letter went to the Wades by email Saturday afternoon and by certified mail Monday morning. Delia's restraining order application was filed Monday morning in Charleston County. The application included the June incident photographs, the documentation of the gate being unlatched on prior occasions, the footage of Garrett climbing the fence, and the detail about the screen enclosure technique that indicated familiarity with the property through repeated prior entry. That detail was important. Delia had flagged it specifically. The technique Garrett had used to open the screen enclosure from outside required knowledge that only came from having been inside the enclosure before and having studied the frame. It was evidence that the June incident was not the first unauthorized entry, only the first confirmed one. Clifton Wade called me Sunday evening, the day after the second letter arrived by email. This time his voice was different. The assumed authority was still there, but something underneath it was less steady. He said, Renee, I think we need to talk about this like reasonable adults before lawyers make it into something nobody can recover from. I said, Clifton, 2 letters have gone out from my attorney. A restraining order application has been filed with the court. I am not able to discuss this outside of that process. He said, a restraining order against my son. Do you understand what that does to a young man? I said, I understand what it means for someone to enter my property twice without permission and with knowledge that it was wrong. The restraining order application is a direct result of that. He said, I am asking you as a neighbor to pull back from this. I said, I am asking you as a property owner to have your family stop entering my property without permission. We have both been asking for things since June. Good night. I ended the call. The restraining order hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, two things happened that changed the shape of the situation considerably. The first thing was that George Tanner from next door knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening and said, in his measured way, that he thought I should know something. He had been in his garden 2 Saturdays ago, the Saturday I had been at the grocery store, and he had seen Garrett Wade climb my back fence. He had also seen Garrett climb it on 2 prior occasions in the spring, once in April and once in May, both times early on weekend mornings. He had not said anything at the time because he was not certain what he was seeing, and he did not want to create a problem if there was not one. But he had since heard through the neighborhood that there was a legal matter, and he wanted me to have accurate information. I thanked George, brought him inside, and recorded his account on my phone with his permission. I sent the recording to Delia that night. She said, "This is significant. It establishes the pattern going back to spring and directly contradicts any claim that these were isolated opportunistic incidents." The second thing was that Paisley Wade, Clifton and Brenda's daughter, posted 2 photographs on her public social media account. The photographs had been posted in late May, before I had installed the cameras, before the June confrontation, before any of the letters or legal proceedings. They showed Paisley and 2 friends at what was unmistakably my pool, my travertine deck, my raised spa, my screen enclosure, my outdoor furniture. The photographs were geotagged with a location that Paisley had created and named herself. She had named it something breezy and confident. She had named it Renee's Paradise, as though it were a public amenity she had discovered and was generously sharing with her followers. I found the photographs because someone in the neighborhood, I never found out who, sent me an anonymous text with a screenshot, and the message thought you should see this. I sent the screenshots to Delia within 60 seconds of receiving them. Delia called me back within 5 minutes. She was using the controlled voice of someone professionally excited. She said, "She geotagged your private property, named it publicly, and the post's date to May, which is before your June confrontation and before any of the formal notices. This is documentary evidence that the unauthorized use of your property was ongoing, known to multiple members of the household, and treated as acceptable and shareable. This also means anyone who visited that geotag or saw those posts and subsequently came to your property did so based on a public invitation issued by someone with no authority to issue it." I said, "How does that affect the case?" She said it expands it considerably. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in Charleston County. Delia and I arrived 20 minutes early. Clifton and Brenda came with an attorney named Randall Voss, who had the look of a man who had reviewed the evidence file and spent the preceding week managing his client's expectations downward. Garrett came with his parents. He sat at the respondent's table and looked at the surface of it with the focused attention of someone who had been told to look calm and was working very hard at it. The judge was a man named the Honorable James Ferreter, who moved through case management with the efficiency of someone who scheduled his days carefully and guarded the schedule like infrastructure. He reviewed the filed materials for several minutes before acknowledging either table. He looked up and said, "Counsel, your client's position is what exactly?" Randall Voss said, "Your Honor, the Wades acknowledge that members of their family used the petitioner's pool on at least 2 occasions. They deeply regret any distress this caused, and they want to assure the court that this behavior has stopped." Judge Ferreter said, "The application includes photographic evidence of the respondent's son climbing a fence to access the petitioner's property after a formal written notice was sent and received. Is that accurate?" Randall Voss said, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Ferreter said, "And the application includes social media posts created by the respondent's daughter naming the petitioner's private pool as a public location and geotagging it, posts which predated the formal notice and which remained publicly accessible until shortly before this hearing." Randall Voss said, "Your Honor, those posts were made without full appreciation of." Judge Ferriter said, "Counsel, I am not asking for an explanation. I am establishing the factual record." The restraining order was granted with terms covering all members of the Wade household. No member of the Clifton Wade family was to access my property by any means for any purpose without my written permission. The court also ordered the Wades to pay my legal fees associated with the application, which amounted to $3,400. Judge Ferriter noted specifically in the record that the social media posts were evidence of a pattern of unauthorized use that had been treated as normal within the Wade household, and that this pattern established the necessity of formal court-ordered boundaries rather than voluntary compliance. Delia filed the civil damages claim 2 weeks after the hearing. The claim covered documented trespass across a pattern of incidents beginning in April, as established by George Tanner's testimony. The June incident, the July incident, damage to the screen enclosure frame from repeated manipulation, the electrical usage from my outdoor outlet across multiple incidents, the use of my outdoor refrigerator across the June incident and likely prior incidents, and compensatory damages for sustained interference with my use and enjoyment of my private property. The social media posts were included as evidence that the interference had been treated as a shareable feature of the Wade household's lifestyle. Randall Voss contacted Delia 3 weeks into the civil proceedings. He wanted to discuss settlement. Delia told me the conversation was brief. She said Randall's voice had the quality of someone negotiating on behalf of clients who did not yet fully understand what the evidence looked like from the outside. Settlement negotiation took 5 weeks. The final number was $21,000. Clifton and Brenda's homeowners insurance covered $15,000. The remaining $6,000 came from Clifton and Brenda directly, which Delia told me had involved a conversation within the Wade household that she had heard described secondhand as significant. The $6,000 personal contribution was the part that mattered most to me. Not because of the amount, though the amount was real, but because insurance paying a claim is an abstract consequence, and a check written from a personal account is a concrete one. It is the difference between understanding that something had a cost and feeling that cost in a way that changes future behavior. I had spent 19 years in infrastructure planning, and I understood the difference between systems that produced consequences people could observe and systems that produced consequences people could avoid noticing. The personal contribution was a consequence that would be noticed. Delia called me when the settlement was finalized. $21,000, she said, plus their fees on top of their own legal costs. Total exposure for the Wades is somewhere around $30,000 when you add everything up. I said good. She said the social media posts were the turning point. Randall told me privately that when his clients saw how the judge had characterized them in the record, they understood for the first time how the whole pattern looked to someone outside the household. I thought about Paisley nomming my pool Renee's Paradise and posting it publicly with the ease of someone who had decided that access to something made it shareable. I thought about Clifton's voice on the phone telling me a civil engineer should understand the practical realities of community living. I thought about what it cost to treat other people's property as available because you had decided it was. It cost $30,000 and a restraining order and a civil court record, and a social media post that still existed in the Internet Archive even after Paisley had taken it down. The screen enclosure got a full-frame repair and a new reinforced door system in September. I had a locksmith install a keyed deadbolt on the exterior door in addition to the interior latch, the kind of hardware that does not yield to someone reaching through a gap at the bottom corner of the frame. I also had the back fence raised by 18 inches along the property line shared with the Wades, which was within my rights under Harborview Terrace's CC and RS, and which I had confirmed with Linda Chen, our HOA coordinator, before scheduling the work. George Tanner watched me supervise the fence installation from his garden. When the crew finished and left, he came over and looked at it. "That is a serious fence," he said. I said, "It is exactly as serious as it needed to be." He nodded. He handed me a paper bag. "Tomatoes," he said, "had more than I could use." I thanked him and went inside and made a salad and ate it on the covered porch looking at the pool through the screen. The water was still and clear. The travertine deck was clean. The furniture was exactly where I had placed it. The outdoor refrigerator was closed. The outlet on the back wall had nothing plugged into it. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Everything was exactly as it should be. I swam that evening at dusk, which I had not done much of during the summer because the summer had been occupied with other things. The water was still warm from the day, and the sky above the screen enclosure was going orange and pink in the way that coastal South Carolina skies do in September, colors that seem slightly excessive until you have lived with them long enough to understand they are just the sky doing what it does. I finished my laps and floated in the deep end looking up at the sky through the screen. The magnolia in the front yard had dropped most of its summer flowers, and the neighborhood was quiet in the way it got in the early evening when the heat finally released and people went inside and the day settled. I had bought this house because of the pool. I had been careful with my mother's inheritance the way she had always been careful with things that cost something real to obtain. I had documented everything from the first day because documentation is what separates problems that get solved from problems that get worse. I had retained an attorney before I urgently needed one and had been glad of it every day since. I had let the legal process do what legal processes exist to do, and I had not deviated from it when someone tried to appeal to my reasonableness as a way of bypassing my rights. The pool was mine. It had always been mine. It was mine in exactly the same way it had been on the day I bought this house. The day I stood in this backyard after signing the closing documents and looked at the travertine deck and the raised spa and the screen enclosure, and understood that this was the nicest thing I had ever owned, and I was not going to take it for granted. I had not taken it for granted. I had protected it the way you protect things that cost something real, with patience and documentation and the willingness to follow through completely. That is what it takes. That is always what it takes. The sky above the screen was fully purple now, and the pool lights had come on automatically the way they did at dusk, and the water around me was warm and lit from below, and I floated in it with my eyes open looking up and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that everything in my backyard was entirely at peace. It was a good evening.